the Silk Roads, what were they? Essentially a network of trade routes. There were never any roads. I mean, we're talking about sort of ancient periods of world history. So they were footpaths, they were camel tracks, they were high mountain passes through the snow. There were maritime routes. There were many sea lanes that were followed and so on. But collectively, as a network, they linked almost all of Eurasia together into a single system of exchanges. In the earlier periods of the Silk Roads, the demand for Chinese silk, which was the major export commodity, came from wealthy Mediterranean women, mostly. Elites such as patricians in Rome or wealthy Byzantine women in Constantinople, who insisted on wearing this very exotic, sexy material called silk. It was silkworm farms in China, often cared for by large groups of women, that created this fabric. Which was then exported usually in bales that were strapped to the sides of camels or carried in ships. But a huge range of sort of intermediaries between China and Rome, for example, that made this exchange possible. People all over Central Asia, Syrians, Iranians, Parthians, Kushans, Tamils, other South Asians and so on. And of course, their camels, their horses, sometimes their mules, and their ships that carried the goods. And through the heart of Central Asia, some really important trade cities emerged to make these exchanges possible. And in today's presentation, I want to introduce you to 3 of those major cities also. These cities often found themselves incorporated into huge tributary empires, so non-traditional empires that were nonetheless under the control of powerful Chinese dynasties, such as the Han and the Tang dynasty. The image on that you can see there lower left is of the Tang tributary empire, which you can see incorporated much of East Asia and Central Asia as far as the Aral Sea. Now, I say non-traditional empires, the city-states would send tribute to Chinese courts and would formally recognize the emperor of the dynasty, right, as their supreme lord. In return, they received far more elaborate, expensive gifts back from the Chinese court and many infrastructure resources, such as irrigation works, certainly military defense. Is something similar happening today with the Belt and Road Initiative of the PRC? It's a question I want you to consider as we work through this lecture, and perhaps something we can talk about in the Q&A afterwards. But again, these empires were not formal empires in the sense that we'd understand them, but loose tributary empires in which everybody recognized the Chinese as their sort of supreme overlords, and in return received a lot of investment from the Chinese. This is a map of the sort of progress of the Belt and Road Initiative, the modern version perhaps of the Silk Roads, showing the land and maritime routes that are already being developed by the People's Republic of China. The term Silk Roads, by the way, is a reasonably modern one. It's not something that ancient peoples would have used at all. It was coined by this man, Baron Ferdinand von Richthofen, who was a quite brilliant geographer, German geographer, who undertook a number of expeditions to China in the mid-19th century. He was the first to sort of construct some maps then of these trade routes that came out of China, and he wondered what to call them. He tried Handelsstrasse, the trade routes, Hauptstrassen, the main routes, but being aware of just how important silk was to all of these exchanges, he settled on Die Seidenstrassen, or the Silk Routes, and the name stuck. A number of explorers that came after von Richthofen, including some of his students, by the way, at university, started to use the term, and it stuck. Some might say today the term Silk Roads has become something of a cliche, although in my writings and my research, I try and sort of dispel that notion. I think it's still a very relevant term, but certainly it's used in a lot of marketing material, Silk Roads trips to Central Asia and so on by tour companies. Nonetheless, I think the term is still very relevant today. Now, of course, material exchanges are what's at the heart of this great network. There's no doubt about that. But non-material exchanges are following, right, in the footsteps of the camel caravans and so on. And it's arguably these non-material exchanges that ended up being the most important in terms of their impact on history. We think about 3 distinct periods of the Silk Roads, by the way. The first, which is the area that I specialize in particularly, between roughly 100 BCE and 250 CE, between mostly the Roman Empire at one end and the Han Chinese Empire at the other end. That fell apart in the mid-3rd century with the collapse of several of those empires. A second period flourished between roughly 600 and 900, when the Tang dynasty, I showed you the map earlier, controlled much of Eastern Eurasia and Central Asia, and Western Eurasia was under the control of the huge Islamic caliphates that were expanding, and also of the Byzantine Empire. And that fell apart with the collapse of the Tang dynasty. Then a third flourished under Mongol hegemony between roughly 1200 and 1400. I won't have time today to talk about that, but that's another fascinating period in Silk Road's history. In each of these periods, the Silk Roads profoundly affected human history in a number of ways, which I would like to sort of show you today. And again, if we are entering a fourth Silk Roads era, we can only speculate on what the impact of that might be, even centuries from now, on world history. This is a fairly recent book of mine on that first Silk Roads period, Empires of Ancient Eurasia, because this ancient period of the Silk Roads was made possible because of the establishment of four powerful empires that effectively stretched from Scotland to Korea. The Roman Empire, the Parthian Empire, the Kushan Empire, and the Han Chinese Empire. Effectively, just four men controlled all of Eurasia from the China Sea to the Atlantic. What were some of the most important non-material exchanges? Well, certainly just ideas about the world, knowledge, culture, ideas about food, about geography, about map making, medicine, for example, that had been devised by Greco-Romans, by South Asian people, Chinese, Islamic people, and intellectuals. These ideas certainly moved back and forward during all three periods. Religions, of course. Where merchants traveled, religion followed. Merchants would talk about their religion, discuss it with other merchants and so on. Buddhism, arguably the most important religion to move along the Silk Roads, but also Islam, Judaism, different versions of Christianity, other religions such as Zoroastrianism, Manichaeism, artistic styles. I'll explore that in the next couple of slides, but ideas about physical representation of humans and how that should be done, different perspectives, lighting and shading and so on. Plagues, certainly. We have evidence from all these periods of major devastating plagues that moved often from the center of the network and then moved in both directions to devastate populations at either end. So all these non-material entities, if you like, moved back and forward across Eurasia into Africa as well because of the Silk Roads. One example I mentioned, art. So in Gandhara, which you can see represented in purple there on the map, sort of northern Pakistan, the first ever image of the Buddha was created. The Buddha had never been represented physically before this. Previous Buddhist art had shown the Buddha either with an umbrella, simply an umbrella symbol to represent the tree that the Siddhartha had sat under to find enlightenment, or footsteps across a stone wall to represent the Buddha's sort of pilgrimage. But it was decided by kings of the Kushan Empire that we would like to have a physical representation of the Buddha. Now, this region had been conquered centuries before by the Greco-Macedonian Alexander, and many Greek merchants and artists had moved into Central Asia as a result of that. So when the idea emerged to create a version of the Buddha, and of course, no one had any idea what the Buddha looked like by this stage. He'd been dead for half a millennium. They used Greco-Roman models. So you've got Central Asian artists and Greek artists using Greco-Roman ideas to represent this profoundly South Asian spiritual figure. This representation then spread along the Silk Roads into East and Southeast Asia, where it was gradually modified to become more Asian-looking, I guess, East Asian. Here's an example. On the left is a Gandharan Buddha carved in this very strong, hard rock. It's a grey schist material. And on the right, a marble statue of a Roman senator from the same period. And you can see the similarities in sort of arm positions, in perspective, certainly in the clothing that they're wearing, the folds of the togas or the robes in the Buddha's case, and so on. So this is a subject that you could pursue yourself. There are many books on Gandharan art and Western influences on it. Of course, Buddhist ideology also spread. The map at the bottom is sort of created by some of these early 20th century explorers who followed Buddhist architecture, if you like, ancient Buddhist architecture through Central Asia and into China. And sort of the red shows where you could see direct influence of Central Asian ideas about Buddhist architecture moving gradually more and more to the east and into China. We know that by 166, the Chinese emperor had declared himself a Buddhist. Extraordinary from that Confucian and Taoist land to declare himself a Buddhist now. Many other Chinese followed, and of course, over the centuries that followed that, most of Korea, many Japanese elites in particular, Tibet, Mongolia, most of Southeast Asia, all converted to Buddhism. And Buddhism has been one of the great sort of peaceful and civilizing religions in world history, and one of the great civilizing influences more generally in world history, a cultural bond that still unites millions and millions of people in Asia today. So they're just two examples of the value, the importance of the Silk Roads to these major non-material exchanges, and further examples of how I say that these earlier periods of the Silk Roads all profoundly influenced subsequent world history. Just a brief photo essay. So Buddhism now connects this group of young novice monks high up in the Himalayas at Tayangbo She in the monastery, creating a mandala out of colored sand. You can see the pots before them where the sand is kept. They'll create this gorgeous mandala, and when it's done, all the monks will symbolically blow it into the air to emphasize that Buddhist law keeps sort of circulating around the world, blown by the winds. So it's connected these young men with these very fashionable young women in Beijing, wearing silk dresses, coincidentally, who've gone to visit a Buddhist temple in the heart of the city during their daily outing. And with this monk in Cambodia in a market in Sihanoukville, wearing the same saffron-colored robes that Siddhartha, the Buddha himself, had recommended his followers wear 2,500 years ago. Moving on to the ancient Silk Roads, we can talk about the specific geography of the routes. How did merchants actually move their goods from such vast distances from East Asia through to the Mediterranean? In this section, we'll talk about the first two Silk Roads eras between roughly 100 BCE and 900 CE. You can see, by the way, the importance of maritime routes here too. So we'll keep that in mind and come back to that a bit later. So the routes left the Han capital, or the capital actually of both the Han and the Tang dynasty, Chang'an, modern Xi'an. Perhaps some of you have visited Xi'an, a gorgeous historical city in Western China today. They followed the Great Walls slowly to the west. Various Chinese emperors kept extending the Great Walls to protect these caravans from militarized nomadic confederations on the steppes to the north. Then they came to this vast inland desert, the Taklamakan Desert, which can be variously translated, but one translation is the land of irrevocable death, giving you some idea of its aridity and harshness. They would use oasis towns around the fringes of the desert. I've mentioned just a couple there, Hotan or Turpan, for supplies and rest. The routes then came back together again at the far end of the Taklamakan Desert at Kashgar, the modern Chinese city of Kashgar. And from there, they went high up over the mountains, across the Pamir Mountains, on towards Central Asia, or an alternative route went south through the Karakoram Mountains, more or less following the modern Karakoram highway route to the Indus Valley and on into South Asia. Whichever route they were following, at Kashgar, Chinese merchants would pass their goods on to various intermediaries who, for a substantial price, would carry them on further. The great world city of Chang'an, the capital of so many of China's ancient dynasties. For 3,000 years, this was the imperial capital of China. The Shang dynasty, perhaps the first and certainly the most important of the original Chinese dynasties, the very early Chinese dynasties. Then the great Zhou dynasty, the Qin, who gave its name to China, the early Han dynasties, and the Tang dynasties. This is a scene from the Beijing Opera set in the imperial court in Tang dynasty, Chang'an. The first emperor's tomb is in Xi'an. Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor to unify large regions of China, chose this city as his capital and also for his tomb. I'm sure a number of you have seen this extraordinary seventh wonder of the world, as it's called today. This is a model of Chang'an centuries later, actually nearly 1,000 years later, during the Tang dynasty, when it had become a vast imperial capital. You can see it superbly planned. The imperial palace is here in the upper right corner. You can see the great Southern Avenue here. You can imagine merchants and diplomats from all over East Asia traveling up this avenue. You can see various gardens and parks and lakes and so on. And all of these wards are very carefully designed. They could all be closed off at night. They were heavily guarded because this was an imperial capital, home to about 2 million people during the second Silk Roads period. The walls in Xi'an today were actually built by the much later Ming dynasty, which withdrew somewhat from engagement in Central Asia These are incredibly impressive still, but the Tang Dynasty walls are about 10 times larger. So you can just imagine these great camel caravans setting out from these walls, wondering if they would ever see Chang'an and China again, heading out to really challenging trips deep into the deserts of the West.